we have, the psyche has two conditions, two important conditions. The one is the environmental influence,
Yes.
and the other is the given fact of the psyche as it is born. The psyche is by no means tabula rasa. We are a definite mixture and combination of genes, and they are there from the very first moment of our life, and they give a definite character even to the little child, and that is a subjective factor looked at from the outside. Now, if you look at it from the inside, then it is just so as if you would observe the world.
Yes.
When you observe the world, you see people, you see houses, you see the sky, you see tangible objects. But when you observe yourself within, you see moving images.
Yes.
A world of images.
Yes.
Generally known as fantasies. Yet these fantasies are facts. You see, it is a fact that a man has such and such a fantasy. And it is such a tangible fact, for instance, that when a man has a certain fantasy, another man may lose his life.
Yes.
Or a bridge is built.
Yes.
These houses were all fantasies.
Yes.
Everything you do here, all of the houses, everything was fantasy to begin with. And fantasy has a proper reality. That is not to be forgotten. Fantasy is not nothing. It is, of course, not a tangible object, but it is a fact nevertheless. It is, a form of energy.
Yes.
Despite the fact we can't measure it.
Yes.
It is a manifestation of something.
Yes.
And that is a reality. That is just a reality as, for instance, the peace treaty of Versailles or something like that. It is no more. You can't show it.
Yes.
But it has been a fact.
Yes. Yes.
And so the psychical events are facts, are realities. And when you observe the stream of images within, you observe an aspect of the world.
Yes.
Of the world within.
The following program deals with a controversial subject. The theories expressed are not the only possible interpretation. Viewers are invited to make a judgment based on all available information.
This is your captain speaking. We are beginning our descent into madness.
Open your mind.
And we are back to another edition of West of the Rockies. I'm Frank. Thank you guys for sticking around. I know it's late for some of you, but we're going to make it worth your while. We have a really, really exciting show lined up for you guys tonight. Genevieve, how you doing over there?
I'm doing quite all right.
You doing good?
Not too bad.
You excited for this one?
Defo looking forward to this.
Tonight, as people may know, and quick shout out to the people listening to us on iHeartRadio, Ustream. And if you're catching the podcast on iTunes or on our website,
future shout out to you.
Hello to you from the past. As I was saying, as many people may know by now, our guest tonight, and we're really excited to have him, is none other than Dr. Rick Strassman, author of the book DMT, The Spirit Molecule. And Genevieve, I know you have an introduction ready for our guest.
Dr. Strassman was born in 1952 in Los Angeles, good old California. And he's a medical doctor specializing in psychiatry with a fellowship in psychopharmacology research. Dr. Strassman was the first person to perform new human studies with psychedelic drugs in the US following the 20-year ban, during which only animal studies were legally permitted. His research involved the powerful, naturally occurring compound DMT, also known as N,N-dimethyltryptamine. It can be found in a myriad of plants and animals, as many of you know, including humans. Commencing in 1990, he administered several hundred doses of DMT to approximately 60 volunteers over the course of about 5 years. Now, his world-renowned book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, documents this research. It has sold over 100,000 copies to date and has been translated into 12 languages. It's also inspired an independent documentary by the same name, which I know a lot of you have watched. It was picked up by Warner Brothers and released fall 2011. With 3 distinguished collaborators, he then went on to co-author Inner Paths to Outer Space, which looks more carefully at the common otherworlds experience that volunteers frequently reported during his research. In 1984, he received lay ordination in a Western Buddhist order and co-founded and for several years administered a lay Buddhist meditation group associated with the same order. Dr. Strassman underwent a 4-year personal psychoanalysis in New Mexico between 86 and 90. He has published nearly 30 peer-reviewed scientific papers, has served as a reviewer for several psychiatric research journals. He's been a consultant to U.S. Food and Drug Administration, National Institute on Drug Abuse, Veterans Administration hospitals, Social Security Administration, and other state and local agencies. Now, if that isn't enough, he's currently Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. He's also president and co-founder of the Cottonwood Research Foundation, which dedicates its research to consciousness. Now, just as a quick side note, you can purchase his books directly from the website, and you can get them signed. And I know for a fact that he does his best to answer his email, so you can contact him via his website.
I've heard people describe their experiences, while using DMT as this ego-crushing experience. Let me tell you, Rick Strassman's list of achievements is pretty ego-crushing.
Don't need DMT now, right?
Yeah. But let's bring on Dr. Rick Strassman. Dr. Strassman, can you hear us okay?
I can. Frank, thanks for having me on, and thanks for that introduction, Genevieve.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Let me start from the beginning. How did you first come to find out about this compound DMT, and what was it that interested you about it?
Well, I found out about DMT during my first independent research study, which was looking at the human biology of the pineal hormone melatonin. This was in the mid-1980s or so. And I was looking at melatonin because it's produced by the pineal gland, and I had a intuition that the pineal was involved in naturally occurring spiritual experiences that weren't related to drugs. There was some evidence at the time. Mm-hmm. This was before much was known about melatonin. There was some evidence at the time that melatonin was quite, psychoactive, maybe even psychedelic. So my study progressed with melatonin. There wasn't especially pronounced effects of the compound on subjective experience. And in the meantime, I learned about DMT, mm-hmm. which is also a naturally occurring compound and is quite psychedelic.
The pineal gland, it's a bit of a mystery, it seems. What did your research find to support the idea that DMT is produced in this small gland in our brain?
Well, I had first, heard about the pineal gland as an undergraduate at Stanford. I had written some class papers on a spiritual or, speculating about the biology or the biological bases of spiritual experience. And I was referred to a professor at Stanford at the time named Jim Fadiman. Mm-hmm. And this was in the early 1970s. He told me that I should look into the pineal gland, which I had never heard of at the time. Mm-hmm. It was still a pretty obscure organ. So there wasn't much known about, melatonin, back in those days. So mm-hmm. I was free to speculate to a pretty, wild extent in, some ways. But as a result of my interest in the pineal, the pineal gland is interesting because it's been, considered to be a spiritual organ by a number of esoteric, physiologies mm-hmm. over the millennia. The Hindu chakra system, mm-hmm. the, Sephirot of the Kabbalah, they all seem to place the location of spiritual experience, the white light of enlightenment or the ultimate encounter with God in a location which corresponds to the anatomical pineal gland in the middle of the skull. Mm-hmm. It, seemed as if it's being an unpaired organ in the brain, one of the only unpaired organs in the brain, also drew the attention of Descartes, who believed it was a spiritual gland in as much as it might potentially mediate the movement of the soul with human consciousness. Mm-hmm. Because people are only able to think of one, thought at a time. He believed, that the pineal gland, with respect to its, being an unpaired organ, could be the, biological conduit or biological, valve, which allowed us to think. If, according to the metaphysics of, that time, believed that, people thought through divine inspiration, coming, down from God, as it were.
Right.
So, the metaphysical speculations aside, it's, seemed as if, melatonin could be psychedelic. And then when that didn't, turn out to be the case, I began, looking, at the responses to DMT given to normal volunteers. I speculated quite a bit in my first DMT book about a pineal origin of DMT. But, that was only established as objective, data just, a couple, 3 years ago. But up until then, it had been known for close to 60 years that the lungs make DMT.
Oh, wow.
So the pineal gland, theory was kind of frosting on the cake in a number of ways. But, people seem to live normal lives without a pineal gland. And if you're looking at, the physiology of, DMT, it seems to be taken care of pretty well through the constant production through the lungs.
And I want to come back to the pineal gland a little later, but let's talk about DMT. I know that DMT, as it's used in the ayahuasca ritual, the ayahuasca ceremonies, it seems to be pretty common in the Americas, specifically Latin America. In your research, where else did you find that DMT was being used?
Well, it was first, discovered in Latin American, psychedelic plants, including ayahuasca and a number of snuffs, psychedelic snuffs, which you would inhale, through your nose. And it was, discovered to be psychedelic in Hungary in the mid-1950s. Then it was discovered in lower animals like rabbits and rats, and then was discovered in the body fluids of humans a few years after that.
Wow.
It was smoked on the street, recreationally in the 1960s, but it, never really got much traction as compared to LSD or mescaline or psilocybin. And it still isn't as, popular as, those drugs, especially psilocybin and LSD. But Terence, McKenna, began to speak about DMT in the 1980s. And, I think as a result of his, speaking about the drug and its, properties, and then, my research, it's become more popular, in the pure, form, just, smoking the freebase of DMT. But I think it's as popular in the Amazonian brew ayahuasca, as you were mentioning, as it, probably is smoked in pure, form.
In the documentary DMT, the Spirit Molecule, it is mentioned that it's also a mystery how these groups of indigenous people managed to find and separate, DMT and turn it into ayahuasca. What are some of the theories as to how this could have happened without modern science or chemistry?
Yeah, it's, kind of a miracle in some ways. If you just swallow DMT by itself, either the pure drug or the drug found in a plant, it's broken down immediately in the gut. And the enzyme which breaks it, down is called monoamine oxidase, or MAO. And if you combine DMT with an inhibitor of the enzyme that breaks it down, then it stays in the gut for a long enough time to be absorbed into the bloodstream and from there to the brain. So the chances, Jeremy Narby is a Swiss anthropologist who's done a lot of research with ayahuasca, and he calculated the odds of just randomly combining two plants, one that contains DMT and one that contains the inhibitor of the enzyme that breaks it down. in order to make an orally active, DMT preparation. And he came up with some number like, 1 in 10 trillion or something like that as, just the random possibility of, combining the, two plants by chance. If you speak to the natives, they tell you that the plants told them that, I think, more specifically, well, the plant which contains the MAO inhibitor is called Banisteriopsis caapi. And, that, seems to be, kind of like the smart plant out there. If you take, that plant and you combine it with other plants, then, the other plants, properties become a lot clearer. So I think if you scratch below the surface, it may turn out to be the case that these people were on the Banisteriopsis and were looking around the forest for the most appropriate, plant to combine with it in order to produce visions. And they, for whatever reason or in, whatever manner, were able to locate, the DMT-containing plant.
I've been thinking about this for a while. I know Frank and I have had a lot of discussions about this, but one of my first thoughts has always been that what people on DMT seem to reach or achieve is something either analogous or almost the same to what people achieve when they're meditating. And I'm talking, Buddhist-style meditations of reaching a nirvana sort of state. So kind of linking to that question, could it in some way be seen as maybe not right or kind of cheating to reach a meditative nirvana without actually going the path, towards it, without, it's kind of like a shortcut? And what are the metaphysical implications of that?
Well, if you think about these plants as tools or these drugs as tools, it's kind of like, are you going to fly to New York or are you going to walk? You could fly to New York and it's, quicker. And if you walked, you would be going through a lot of experiences. You would have talked to a lot of people. It would have been a lot harder. And you probably would have enjoyed your experience in, New York a lot, more than if you just, hopped on a commuter plane, something that you do once a month or, something like that. But at, the same time, if you do your homework before going to New York, you can get a lot out of it. Perhaps the, same amount that you would if you had walked there. So I think when it comes to what, some people have called the gratuitous, grace of the psychedelics or the, shortcut to nirvana or, similar expressions, I think, there is, some truth behind that idea, that if it is too easy, you don't appreciate it. Or if it's instant and all you have to do is smoke a substance or swallow a pill, that you're not going to feel like you've deserved it or you've worked up to it. You've, done all the, preliminary steps. A lot of the preliminary, kind of work that is involved with a prayer practice or a meditation practice includes, intellectual training and ethical training, to understand what you're about to embark on, the best ways of interacting with people in the spiritual worlds in order to, get the most out of your life. So those are the kind of, foundational, practices which are, developed and, practiced before you attain these higher states. And once you attain the higher states, you're able to place them in some context, both interpersonally, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. And I think if you're not prepared, if you have no, foundation, you don't really know what you're seeing. You can't really extract much useful information from it. You may even end up being more confused than you were when than before you had that experience. So I think if you compare the experiences themselves, they're extremely similar. For example, in my new book on the prophetic state, compare descriptions of the prophetic experience in the Hebrew Bible with descriptions of the volunteers, DMT experiences. And, the content of the states are quite, they're extremely similar. But, clearly the impact of the prophetic state as recorded in the Bible is a lot more pervasive and enduring than the reports of my DMT volunteers. So I think it is a lot, more than the pure experience all by itself. It needs to be placed in some context and communicated in as beautiful and resonant a kind of language as possible. Those kinds of issues are quite important.
In your book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, you talk about Aldous Huxley, who tried LSD in the 50s under the supervision of a psychiatrist. He supported a theory that psychedelics, should only be accessible to a select few people because the average person would not be capable, I guess, of reaping the benefits, if you will, of psychedelics. So I guess I got a two-part question. Number one, are psychedelics in general something that can be used recreationally? And number two, would you advise somebody to have a guide, or as we see in Latin America and some other cultures, a shaman that seems to guide them through their experience?
Well, yeah, I mean, those are very important questions. From a historical point of view, there were two camps which emerged in the 60s. One was the kind of elitist camp, represented by Huxley. And the other was the more kind of blue-collar, everybody egalitarian kind of approach, like everybody ought to be able to, to take these drugs because, they're inherently good and you'll have a good experience no matter what. That was kind of the, Tim Leary and Ken Kesey approach. Right. So I think there's pros and cons to both of those. With respect to the elitist approach, you would probably have fewer adverse effects if fewer people took them, and it was a more sophisticated sample of people that were using these drugs, and I guess perhaps more philosophy, science, and whatnot could emerge from people taking those drugs than just your average Joe Blow. But on the other hand, there were a lot of people who took these drugs without much preparation or supervision or understanding of what they were getting into, and they had a full blown mystical or spiritual experience, and then they went on to understand it, to integrate it, to do research, for example, to enter religious training, to become an artist or a scientist. So I think if it weren't for, Tim Leary and, Ken Kesey and the more egalitarian approach, not as many people would have, been exposed to these drugs, and all of the good wouldn't have, come out of, that kind of more, free-for-all use. But at, the same time, there were a lot of casualties, a lot of, psychiatric casualties, health problems from overdoing it with these drugs in a unsupervised, kind of, condition. There were a lot of, psychotic breaks, a lot of suicide, a lot of, mental damage as a result of completely unsupervised use, combination with other drugs and alcohol, not being very, stable psychiatrically in the first place. Those kinds of, setups, for adverse effects. So it's been a, mixed bag, and, evolution, marches on. So I think we're still, figuring out the best, setting in which, to take these drugs. There are, shamanic models. The ayahuasca culture has, come out of a shamanic model, which is one in which, somebody who's especially trained with these plants or drugs, receives a calling and then undergoes a, rigorous apprenticeship and, training and background, work with these and other plants. I think a lot of people are describing themselves as shamans without very good credentials behind them. So I think if you have a good, shaman, you can, get some extra benefit, from having your experience, supervised to their eye. But at the same time, there are increasing number of poorly trained, shamans who, may be more or less unscrupulous in their practices. They may charge a lot of money, give bad ayahuasca, sexually abuse, their, clients, take them for a lot of money. So I think you can experience the states that these drugs, lead one to, recreationally, if you're, thinking about using that term as, relaxation or creativity or pleasure, those, kinds of motivations. If you're interested in, doing, psychotherapy either on yourself or in a group, let's say, it can be helpful to have a trained, psychotherapist who, in some ways, their duties or responsibilities overlap with those of a shaman. There still isn't really a clerical model within the West, for the use of these plants or drugs, like rabbis or priests or Zen masters aren't giving these, substances within the context of, their, religious environment. So I think, that is still going to be point of some contention and interesting, to watch its development.
I wanted to ask you about the 1950s seemed to be a time where there were experiments carried out using psychedelics, and in your book you mentioned one in particular called, and pardon me if I butcher the name and feel free to correct me, but I believe it's pronounced Thorazine. And it was described as, quote, the single greatest advance in the history of psychiatric care. And the drug made it possible for seriously mentally ill patients to improve and leave the asylums in large numbers. So it seems that people were finding the benefits of using these chemicals to treat people with mental disorders. At what point did psychedelics become taboo and a bad thing and vilified in society?
Well, so the three, legs of what I call the tripod of modern psychopharmacology, which is responsible for all of the antidepressants out there now, the stimulants, the antipsychotic medications, the nootropics, the mood stabilizers, those all kind of, stand upon the tripod of psychopharmacology, which was first established in the late 1940s. And at that time, there were three discoveries. One discovery was the presence of, serotonin as a neurotransmitter in the human brain. That was the first known neurotransmitter, a chemical responsible for the communication between, nerve cells in the brain. The second, discovery at around that time were the effects of LSD, which was potent in extremely small quantities, like 10 times the potency.
Wow.
Let's see, like 1,000 times the potency of mescaline, which had been previously studied in humans, but because of the large, doses that, needed to be given, and, the general, toxicity, the vomiting and the diarrhea with a big dose of mescaline, it, never, became especially popular within psychiatry, but LSD was discovered in, the 1940s, and it was potent and, thousands of, times, as strong as mescaline was. And the third, leg of the tripod, was, the discovery of the drug chlorpromazine. Its, trade name is Thorazine, and it's an antipsychotic drug. It was used to treat schizophrenics, and as a result, there was a huge exodus of chronically ill mental patients who were finally able to have their symptoms placed under moderate amount of control. And it was interesting because all three of those compounds are related in some ways. Thorazine is a blockader of the receptors in the brain, which are turned on by serotonin. There's a chemical pharmacological similarity between LSD and serotonin. Thorazine would block the effects of LSD. So all three of those drugs were related chemically and pharmacologically. LSD was studied quite extensively in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and it was used in a number of different contexts. One of the ways, was to understand, how, mental illness occurred. Some people within the research community, called LSD and, similar drugs, psychotomimetic drugs. In other words, they mimic, features of naturally occurring psychosis. And, they figured if you could, temporarily cause a, psychotic state with LSD, you might be able to understand its, physiology and maybe even develop some cures. Another context for giving LSD during that time was to treat mental illness. And there was a huge, literature which was accumulated in describing the use of LSD and related compounds, for neurosis, for depression, for drug abuse, alcoholism and heroin abuse, PTSD, autism, post-traumatic stress, cases of OCD. So, that was an extremely promising area. There was another, area in which people in training who were interested in empathizing with, their psychotic patients, were given LSD as a temporary psychosis. And, that was, supposed to increase their empathy or understanding of the mental state of other patients. There were some, kind of early attempts to understand, the biology of LSD, but, things were still at kind of a, rudimentary stage, before all of the human research ended. Also, after, there was the discovery of DMT in human beings, there was a lot of interest in, comparing the DMT state to schizophrenia. There were quite a few attempts, to compare the concentrations of DMT in, normal controls, versus the concentrations in, psychiatrically ill individuals. So those, were the main, contexts, for the psychedelic, research community at the time. Also speaking of, psychotherapy, there was also, some interest in using these compounds to help ease the anguish of a terminal illness diagnosis. So LSD and related compounds were used to help with, cancer patients who were dying and in pain and depressed and anxious. But, human studies all ended with the epidemic of, the public health problems which accompanied all of the, widespread uncontrolled use of these drugs in the 60s, early 70s. And, they were all scheduled, and were quite, difficult, to use after that point in human research, that occurred in the year 1970. So yeah, it was almost 20 years, that human studies, went into, hibernation and until my DMT study got off the ground in late, 1990.
Just a quick question. You were talking about, the drugs were scheduled, and DMT, according to the Drug Enforcement Administration, is a Schedule 1 drug, which is grouped in with other drugs like heroin, LSD, marijuana, ecstasy, and peyote. A Schedule 1 drug is a drug considered to be the most dangerous class of drugs with a high potential for abuse and potentially severe psychological and or physical dependency. Terence McKenna, however, is famously quoted as saying that psychedelics are illegal not because of loving government is concerned that you may jump out of a third-story window. Psychedelics are illegal because they dissolve opinion structures and culturally lay down models of behavior and information processing. They open you up to the possibility that everything you know is wrong. What are your thoughts on Terence McKenna's statement? Do you think that could be a reason why things like DMT and LSD were classified as such dangerous drugs?
No, I just don't agree with that. There were a lot of people jumping out of third-story windows after taking LSD. One of my good buddies on the track team in high school, was in a hotel room in Las Vegas, took LSD, thought he could fly, jumped out the window and he died. So I think those weren't apocryphal stories. They were actually taking place, and I think with an increasing amount of those reports coming in, the government freaked. I mean, they thought, this is bad. These are bad drugs and we have to restrict their availability and increase penalties, for possession, manufacture, distribution. So I think it was compounded in, some ways by, folks like Tim Leary who were, telling everybody to take these drugs. And, free your mind, tune in, turn on and drop out. And I don't think people were worried that, it was a huge, wave of enlightenment that was spreading across the West, but a huge, wave of adverse, psychiatric effects. I think that, by and large, the government, really doesn't care if everybody's enlightened or not, but they do care if people are freaking out, ending up in hospitals,
Right.
Kind of gouging out their eyes, jumping out of buildings, so I think, they were responding to what they considered to be a, public health epidemic, and they had to do what they could as quickly as they could. But, if you look at the congressional hearings for scheduling these, drugs, it's, quite interesting, because all of, the psychiatrists, were saying, yeah, these drugs can be dangerous if they're misused, but, trust us, we're doctors and we can, keep, grip on things. But the congressmen were saying, well, obviously not. Look at Tim Leary. I mean, he's a scientist and he's, promoting all kinds of, crazy stuff. So, I think that, legitimate, psychiatric research got caught in, some serious, crossfire. And, the subtleties of, set and setting, supervision, preparation and, follow-up were, lost on the lawmakers who, saw, I guess, somewhat of a chance to score political points as, being concerned with, public health. But, I also think that, the scientists could have done a better job in both educating the population and also to, keep a, shorter leash on, some of the more, wild-eyed claims that were, coming out. And, if you look at the media coverage now, with, the renaissance of human psychedelic research, it's completely night and day. The media is interested and respectful. They're not making, crazy claims that these drugs were established to be unsafe and couldn't be used no matter what. They're quite, level-headed in, their reporting of, contemporary scientific research. But at the same time, this new generation of, researchers is being a lot more circumspect in their claims as to what these drugs do, what their potential benefits are, what their potential risks are, as opposed to, saying they're all good or, they're all bad. Both, the scientific and the media communities, seem to be able to be presenting it in a lot more of a nuanced, manner than occurred the first time around.
I have a question, or at least a thought, going back to the more technical side of things. And a while ago I was reading about progesterone and how it's an antagonist for the sigma receptors. And at the same time I was reading about DMT being an agonist for the sigma-1 receptor. So when I, read the section in your book, and unfortunately you weren't able to carry out the research to the full, but you did briefly research the menstrual cycle potentially affecting DMT or other psychedelic experiences. So my question is that if progesterone is an antagonist for sigma-1 receptors and DMT is an agonist, is the idea basically then that women could experience DMT or similar things differently, or in fact, at a reduced lower rate, and what the implications of that would be, if that makes sense? Sorry, I'm not an expert in these things. No. I think that's a very good question. And in my study of DMT, we standardized when in the menstrual cycle we brought people in order to keep things to as regulated a manner as we could. We usually brought people in within the first week of their cycle. Like after the bleeding stopped. And, that is the time, that the hormonal, milieu in a woman is the closest, to that of a man. The estrogen levels are pretty low. The progesterone levels are pretty low. And it, seemed as a result of, the basic, science of estrogen, modifying the number and the properties of the serotonin receptor. It also modifies the serotonin receptor. And most of the attention to understanding how the psychedelics work in the brain have been focusing on the serotonin receptors. And I was interested in determining, is there any modification of the DMT response across the cycle.
So I think we studied just, one woman, and it was only at a couple of points in this cycle. I didn't get any funding to do that study, so we really couldn't expand it very much. And, the sigma site is also an increasingly, focused upon area of the psychedelics, DMT and other compounds. Also, there is increasing information about the crosstalk between the serotonin and the glutamate system. So I think all of those are changing over this over the course of the stages of the menstrual cycle, and even after menopause as well, or even before menstruation begins. So there is interest from NIH to look at
women's responses to new agents, new drugs, antibiotics, steroids, psychoactive drugs, especially the antidepressants and antipsychotics. But, to my knowledge, I don't think there's really any human research going on at this point, looking at that question. Does the response to psychedelics, change over the cycle?
Yeah, I guess my question was motivated by the idea of, if DMT really is a spirit molecule, if it's a true spiritual experience, then it's interesting to question why some people or of a certain gender should experience more intense things. That was it, basically.
Yeah, I suppose if you speak to, people that have a lot of experience giving ayahuasca or taking ayahuasca, because, there's a lot more, people drinking ayahuasca than there are using DMT, I think. And I would imagine if you queried those groups, you would get some interesting, data regarding menstrual, cycle, modifications of, people's experiences. But I'm just not that familiar with any of those data.
Yeah.
With respect to DMT, I suppose naturally occurring DMT, perhaps, mediating non-drug spiritual states. That still is speculative. We don't really, have the capability to measure naturally occurring DMT in humans. The concentrations are just, too low for our present technology. So it, could be, that women, may produce more DMT at certain times of the month, or they might be more responsive to it. They may be, more responsive to their naturally produced, DMT over the menstrual cycle. And, that, may mean that, women, if, they're meditating in a retreat for a month, they, may, possibly be more prone to experience a spiritual state as a result of prayer or of meditation at a certain, time of the month than others. So that'd be interesting. You could, kind of increase or, change your meditation practice, depending on, the time of the month. Comparable to the ayahuasca communities out there, there must be data, within the contemplative communities describing, different, rates of enlightenment or kensho or, satori in their, female practitioners.
Prior to your research, which we're going to get into here in just a few short minutes, there had been a ban on these type of studies. And before the ban, psychedelics and some DMT research had occurred on animals and on humans. So it's another two-part question, if I may. Number one, what was there to learn testing or psychedelics on animals? And number two, what was different about the DMT research done in humans back then to the research you would eventually go on and do years later?
Well, I think what occurred after the ban of human studies was, that research with animals continued. So the interest, was on biology of LSD and related drugs. You had to kind of establish an animal model of the psychedelic, drug effect, which, is increasingly, been refined over the decades. But I think, primarily it's been focused on, the biology of these drugs. And I
as a result of LSD studies, that was kind of responsible, for the, determination of the different subtypes of the serotonin receptors out there.
Yeah.
That occurred in the early 1980s. I think that quite a few of the animal studies, which ultimately, led, to the development of the, serotonin reuptake, blocking antidepressants like Prozac, all of them used LSD as a probe of, serotonin function, which helped explicate and advance our understanding of how antidepressants worked. Another way in which animals were used in during the 20-year hiatus, was to understand similarities and the differences between the various psychedelic drugs. And there is a model which was developed, which is still in current use, which is called the drug discrimination model. And in that model, you give an animal some LSD, and it learns to recognize the inner state which the drug will cause.
Yeah.
And you can tie the inner state of the animal in response to the LSD, to being fed. So if an animal is on LSD and it presses a bar, it will get fed. If it isn't on LSD, it'll press the bar and it won't get fed. So you can you can train an animal to respond to LSD, or to recognize LSD, and then you can give other drugs like DMT or DOI or psilocybin or 5-methoxy-DMT, and you can determine, by the, similarity in the, bar pressing response, the degree of, similarity of the inner state that's being reported by the lower animal. So that, even though it's crude, it still is, pretty sensitive, in, terms of one being able to determine that a new drug is LSD-like or not LSD-like, but still the gold standard is you give it to a human and you ask them, to compare the effects. So with respect to your question about comparing DMT studies now and DMT studies, back in the day, the emphasis on, DMT in the, 60s was to understand its, role in, psychosis, especially schizophrenia. So, people were, looking at, levels in the blood of DMT and metabolites in, normal controls versus schizophrenics. Yeah. And, also they were giving DMT to, normal controls and then comparing the responses to schizophrenics, or else giving DMT to schizophrenics and asking, the other patients, to compare, the hallucinations or the visions on DMT with, those which would occur, naturally in the course of their illness. So, that was kind of the emphasis at the time. There wasn't any therapeutic emphasis per se.
Yeah.
There were some studies with a compound like DMT, which is called, DPT. It isn't found in nature. It's a laboratory, creation.
Okay.
And it was used as within the context of, substance abuse, treatment protocols, like, for alcoholism and, for heroin abuse. And it was also used in some protocols for the terminally ill. But, DPT is kind of a chemical, curiosity as, much as anything. It isn't especially, popular on the street, and it isn't, being, studied scientifically at this point. It isn't a, compound that is, found in nature at all. Current studies with, DMT have been pretty few. There was, my study in which, case we were just interested in, characterizing its responses, or, the responses in our volunteers. They were normal volunteers. They were all experienced with, psychedelics. And I was asking, biological and, psychological kinds of questions. We weren't, doing any treatment of any sort. We were just, giving as much, DMT to as many people as we could, and, seeing what the biological responses were and the psychological responses. Once we completed that study, we looked at tolerance, giving DMT repeatedly over the
space of the morning, to determine if people's response is lessened with repeated exposure, which is the case with all of the other drugs out there like LSD. And we discovered that people didn't develop tolerance. That the fourth dose of DMT was as powerful as the first. So then we started looking at some of the specific kinds of serotonin receptors, which were mediating the DMT effect. There was one study after ours giving pure DMT. It was a study in Germany, and they were comparing the responses of DMT to the responses to ketamine, which is also a psychedelic agent in smaller doses. Usually it's used as an anesthetic agent, but if you give smaller doses, it's pretty psychedelic. And that was a comparison study giving a continuous infusion of DMT over several hours with a continuous infusion of ketamine over several hours. And their specific question was to compare specific types of psychotic symptoms. In other words, if you gave DMT was that more like the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, and if you gave ketamine, did that cause the negative symptoms of schizophrenia? So that was kind of a European model, the psychotomimetic model of the psychedelic drug effect. So those are really the only two DMT projects which have occurred since the renewal of human studies. There have been a larger number of ayahuasca studies, which, it's, as we were talking about earlier, it contains an orally active, version of DMT. Most of those ayahuasca studies have, taken place in Barcelona, Spain. And, those have, mostly been, biological as well. Understanding the responses in the brain, endocrine or hormonal responses, sleep effects, those kinds of things. They haven't been, therapeutic or spiritual in orientation.
On that note, I've got a quick question. Have MAOIs ever been researched in conjunction with DMT? Because it seems that would at least imitate ayahuasca to some extent.
Well, there's quite a bit of information from the field anyway. People combining either pure DMT with botanical MAO inhibitors, like is found in the Banisteriopsis plant, or in Syrian rue, or Peganum harmala. Some of the other plants which contain an MAO inhibitor. Also, people have combined pure DMT with pharmaceutical monoamine oxidase inhibitors, like meclobamide. But I don't think there have been any real human studies recently combining MAO inhibitors with giving DMT. I've heard stories of people smoking DMT after pre-treating with an MAO inhibitor, or they've even taken an MAO inhibitor and then taken psilocybin. That seems kind of hair-raising.
The experiences are prolonged, or as you'd expect.
Yeah, it's prolonged and more intense, and you can get a little more toxic, a bit more confused and delirious. One of the questions about if you blockade MAO, are you able to then measure levels of DMT which occur naturally? Because in the case of ayahuasca, when you combine an MAO inhibitor with DMT, you get high concentrations of the nitrogen oxide of DMT, which are even higher concentrations than concentrations of DMT itself. So there was a little pilot study that just occurred at UC Berkeley, giving an MAO inhibitor to people for a couple of days, and then collect their urine in an attempt to discover, like, if you give an MAO inhibitor in the normal state, would you then be able, to measure this nitrogen oxide, because you aren't able, to measure the parent compound with current technology. But, that study seems to have been a negative result. Either the MAO, wasn't given in a high enough dose or at the right time. Those kinds of questions still remain to be clarified. But, like if a normal person, takes an MAO inhibitor, you're not going to increase your levels of, DMT to the point of having a, so-called, naturally occurring DMT experience.
Yeah.
When you were getting ready to start your research, I've heard that you can administer DMT, you can smoke it, you can snort it, you can administer it via IV. And I know that also you tried intramuscular injection. Which method proved to be the best for your research and why?
Well, the first group of studies giving, DMT in humans all gave it in the intramuscular route, the Hungarian studies and the American studies. There was one study where they gave it intravenously to some schizophrenic lady whose heart stopped beating, and they had to resuscitate her, and it was kind of a mess. So I think everybody was, keen on giving it as an intramuscular dose. But I was getting my, funding from the National Institute on, drug abuse. And one of the, rationales for requesting, funding, from them, was within the context of, DMT being an abused drug, like a minor abused drug, but still it was, being, used on the streets. And if we understood its effects, we might then be able to understand, those of more popular drugs like LSD and psilocybin. So I was, keen on, reproducing the smoked effect. Which is the way it's used most often in, recreationally or in the field. And by smoked DMT, I'm referring to vaporizing the free base of DMT. And after that, you would inhale, the vaporized drug. That's what's called smoking DMT. And there were a couple of volunteers in our early, group of individuals who had smoked DMT. And because I was interested in, replicating the smoked effect, psychologically, we gave them an intramuscular dose of DMT. And, we asked that, person, to compare it to the smoked effect.
Right.
And well, so his description of the muscular route was that it was a lot slower and, wasn't as intense as the smoked effect. So then we, switched over rather quickly to the intravenous route, and it, seemed to replicate the smoked effect, and even may have been like a half step quicker, than the response to smoking DMT. Well, one thing, if any of your listeners aren't, familiar with the DMT effect, if it's either smoked or injected intravenously, it begins to work within a heartbeat or two, and the effects, peak within a couple of minutes, then start to resolve within about, 5 or 10 minutes, and they're pretty much gone within a half hour to 40 minutes.
Yeah, I've heard it described as being shot out of a cannon in the past. There's a question in the chat that I want to ask you, and it will kind of segue to my next question. But Professor Madness in the chat, he's asking how many times has Dr. Strassman, done DMT himself? Did you try this on yourself before you went into your research, or not?
Well, so that is a question that I am posed a number of times, and I've got kind of a stock answer. If I tell people that I have, then I'll be accused of being a zealot, and if I tell people I've not, I'll be accused of not knowing what I'm talking about. So that's my answer. My answer also is, what is the motivation behind that question?
Wow.
I'm reporting people's experiences.
Yeah.
Like, I gave this drug, and I took careful notes, and I drew blood, and that's what I'm talking about. There are so many self-reports of I smoked DMT, and now I have the answer to the beginning of the universe and why things are as they are. It just isn't that useful. Even if you're the most objective and clear-eyed person in the world, your experience is your experience. So I, set about, collecting as much information as I could from a sophisticated and intelligent group of, subjects as I could, and, documented, that as carefully as I could. And, that's what I've written about, that's what I've talked about, that's what I've speculated about.
Related to that, then, do you ever release any personal information about yourself as regards, your spiritual or religious beliefs? Or do you make a point to keep that separate?
No, I'm a lot more comfortable, talking about that because it's influenced my approach to the work. I don't talk about my own religious experiences. per se, but I do talk about in my first DMT book the spiritual approach that I had, brought to bear on my study. I had spent a number of years practicing and studying within a Zen Buddhist community or extended organization, and I approached people's drug experiences from that perspective. Like, it was kind of an I didn't really intrude much on people's experiences.
Yeah.
There weren't any, props, so to speak. I just let, people have their own experience. Kind of like, the bare bones, Zen practice, as opposed to, bells and mandalas and incense and candles and chanting and mudras and mantras and whatnot. It was more like I was interested in, creating a space where people could have whatever experience was going to happen. And also our approach to people's experiences was kind of hands off. We would kind of enter into a light state of meditation to stay alert to what was going on in the room and within ourselves, but we didn't ask a lot of questions. We didn't massage people or hold their hands. If they needed help, we provided it, but generally we just, kept a few steps removed. And I, developed, the rating scale that we used to quantify the DMT effect using Buddhist psychological principles.
Oh, wow.
So I speak about that in my DMT. Yeah, and I was also, kind of expecting, based on my, Buddhist experience, that the ultimate effect of the DMT, high dose would be an enlightenment-like state. So, so I am upfront with, the influence of my, religious, background on the study itself, how I conceived of the study, how I performed it, what my expectations were, the, means of interpreting people's experiences.
Dr. Strassman, I wanted to ask you about the brave group of people you found to help you in your research. What can you tell me about the volunteers? What were you looking for when you began to look for volunteers for this study?
Well, I was interested in, psychologically healthy people, medically healthy people, with some experience with, the psychedelic, drugs. The first group of, volunteers, as it turned out, were my friends, who were kind of rooting me on from the sidelines for the couple of years, that it took to get my study off the ground. But yeah, once I got permission, I just, put out the word, and people were lining up.
I bet.
It was a, sophisticated and intelligent group of, people. There were doctors, psychologists, teachers, scientists, physicians, bureaucrats, school teachers. There was a couple of graduate students. There's a nurse or two, science writers, mathematicians. Yeah, I screened people very carefully. I would screen people by asking them a couple of, pointed questions. One question would be, what's the highest you've ever been? Well, and another question was, what's the most scared and regressed you've ever been on, the psychedelics? And, the reason, that I asked, that question, was in order, to gauge, the inner resources of the potential volunteers. Like, what would they do, or, what would happen if they began to panic or found themselves in a tight spot on the, DMT effect. There was one guy, a young guy, and I asked him that question as, part of the screening interview. And he, told me that every time he took a large, dose of mushrooms, he would find himself on the roof of a house or of a building. And he never, knew how he got up there.
That's
and
scary.
it was always a hassle to get down.
Wow.
That's scary.
So I said to him and myself, I just don't think you're really cut out for this study. Yeah. So those kinds of questions were important. I screened people medically as well. I excluded anybody with high blood pressure or any heart disease, any thyroid disease, those kinds of things. Yeah, so it was quite, difficult to get into the study. And I actually was, discouraging most people, like, this is going to be really intense and you're going to be in the hospital and you will have a couple of intravenous lines in place. You won't be able to move. It's going to smell bad in there. Yeah, I think as a result of, getting people to understand, the rigors of the study, before, they got involved. I think it increased the percentage of people who were volunteering for altruistic purposes, much more than just like a new, drug experience. Because as a result of my screening out, people who weren't especially, serious about the demands of the protocol, they were interested in the potential benefits of these drugs, both spiritual and psychological, even medical, and they were agreeable and they were willing to do whatever it took in order to increase our knowledge about them.
Mm-hmm.
When your research began and you started to compile your reports on what the volunteers experienced, in your book you talk about how you could divide them into three major categories: personal, invisible, and transpersonal experiences. Can you tell me a little bit about these three categories and what are the characteristics of each of them?
So the personal kinds of experiences were either on the lower doses or took place in people that didn't have what would be called spiritual or breakthrough experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And those were more along the lines of what might occur in psychotherapy, like I guess psychotherapy on steroids or turbocharged psychotherapy. They would be able to work through individual conflicts, concerns, problems, emotional, blockages, psychosomatic symptoms or pain, those kinds of things. In some ways, like if, they had, some visions, they would be a little more, consistent with a dream-like state, in which case the contents of, the visions seem to be more related, to their own psychology than perhaps some external reality out there that they were tapping into. The transpersonal states were the more spiritual ones, where they, I guess, you might, call them the near-death-like states, the more, mystical states, kind of union with the one with the white light. The invisible, the experiences of the invisible worlds were the more unexpected, category, and actually were the most common, especially after the high doses. Right. And, these were reports that the volunteers returned with of entering into a world of light, which, seemed inhabited by, sentient beings who expected them, interacted with them for good and for ill, were aware of them. The volunteers could interact with them quite, fulsomely, ask questions, get answers, negotiate and bargain. So those were the more unexpected, kinds of effects, which ended up actually, being the more, or, the most, common, especially after the high doses.
Before we touch on some of these entities, I've heard stories from people who have encountered beings on other substances like LSD or after taking mushrooms, etc. However, you say in your book, and I apologize, I hope I'm not taking it out of context, but you said in your book that only with DMT do people meet up with quote-unquote them, with other beings in a non-material world. So my question is, are DMT encounters more real, whereas encounters with entities using other substances are or could be mere hallucinations or just dreams?
Well, the comment about, only with DMT does, somebody, report the contact with beings. I think at the time when I wrote that, I was referring to the scientific literature.
Okay.
Because, some of the Hungarian studies described, contact with beings in, the 1950s, 1960s. If you would read through, the literature or, the scientific literature on LSD and, psilocybin, there weren't any reports of being contact. And even in the field, the prevalence of contact with beings on other drugs than DMT is pretty rare. But, DMT is, kind of notorious or, famous or infamous, for reliably producing contact with beings. So the location of the beings, what's their nature, where do they reside, what's their function? I mean, obviously, those are enormously huge questions ontologically, epistemologically, heuristically, psychological, spiritual,
Yeah.
and you can, I think, choose from any number of, potential options, right now, because, the jury is out. Nobody has, said, for sure these beings are just, the product of abnormal brain metabolism. Nobody, has, definitely established, that they're extra, terrestrials, which we contact through our mind-brain complex being modified by DMT, or, something in between. They're just a dream, or they're just a, psychological construct, representing something else. I think we ought to be open to, whatever they are. When you're asking about what kind of DMT work is going on, nowadays compared to the first, wave of studies, I think, one thing which would be, very important to, look at is to study the DMT beings,
Right.
to really look, carefully at what their, nature is. And, for example, you could give a continuous infusion of DMT for an hour or 2 or 3 hours, and you can increase the dose, decrease, the dose over the space of the study session. And you could get people to work with the beings, to describe them, to ask them questions, to really kind of flesh them out. When you smoke DMT or you give it just as a one, shot injection, it's, it's over so quickly. The element of being so stunned as a result of finding yourself in this world can be, kind of disorienting, and you're not able to interact with the beings at quite the same, level that you could with a slower, more continuous, kind of effect. There's, quite a bit of information out there with ayahuasca, but, because that's a longer acting experience. It takes about an hour to start working and is over in about, 6 hours or so. And, the peak effects might, have a duration of an hour or 2. So you can interact, with the beings, but, it's not quite as controlled an environment, let's say, as what would occur in a laboratory setting.
Right.
With, pure DMT, that the levels were going up and down, depending on one's response. So I think it would be, very important to, look at the DMT beings, to correlate the descriptions of the beings with the personality of the research, volunteer. Like if you have a neurotic volunteer, will their beings be of a particular type and function? If you have a healthy volunteer, if you have a spiritually oriented one, if you have a Jewish one, a Buddhist one, a Christian one, a Muslim one, what is, the nature of the beings, relative, to the person encountering them. And it, may turn out that they're just, purely a result of the brain being on drugs, or they could be external beings that exist on another level of reality. There are some, models, could contain, that idea, like dark matter and, parallel universes. So, I think, it's important to, characterize the beings to a lot greater extent than the hit and miss approach that has, kind of taken place up until now.
Following on from what you were just saying, kind of more of a philosophical question, but do you think it matters in the same way that people question Robert Nozick's experience machine? Do you think it matters then whether the experiences on DMT are, so to say, real or possibly just completely hallucinogenic if the effect that, people come out with is a positive one?
Well, yeah. The whole, question of the reality basis of the DMT state, it gets kind of complicated when you look at the science. One of the very curious properties of DMT is that it's transported into the brain across the blood-brain barrier using energy that the brain expends in order to get DMT into it.
And there are very few substances that the brain treats that way. The only substances seem to be ones which are required for normal brain function, like blood sugar and certain amino acids necessary for the synthesis of proteins, which the brain isn't able to make on its own. So if you think about the philosophical implications of DMT, seemingly being required for normal brain function, that is kind of mind-boggling, like on its own, because, normal brain function, it equates with, normal consciousness, so it, may be that a specific, window of brain DMT is required for our perception of consensual reality. DMT could be some kind of reality thermostat or an endomatrix. It's the matrix which the brain is kind of generating on its own, which gives coherence to everyday reality. And it gets even more specific if you look at some more recent data which came out of the University of Wisconsin a few years ago, in which case the activity of the gene responsible for the enzyme that makes DMT is quite active in the retina.
Okay.
So it may be that DMT is mediating our general perception of the world, and specifically our visual perception of the world. So that begins to beg the question of what is real and what may be just a very elaborate DMT hallucination. But still, I mean, even if that were the case, you still have to think about why things are configured that way. Why is it that the brain requires DMT? Like I mean, either who or what designed things in such a manner. So I think you're still left with an external locus at a certain point. People didn't just come out of the blue. People were created. The universe was created. DMT was created, and I think it's a bit self-important to believe that that we are the generator of all of our experience. I think it's just as likely that we are like a recipient of information and experience, rather than being the first cause, as it were. So I think it would impact our relationships if one wants to look very carefully at the reality basis versus hallucinogenic bases for these experiences. Would you be any less kind or any gentler, any more compassionate, any more violent, or any more sadistic if this were an hallucination or if it weren't? So I think at a certain point you just have to decide how you want to act, and then try to dig deeper with every opportunity possible.
Going back to the entities which your volunteers described as, clowns, reptiles, mantises, bees, spiders, cacti, stick figures, from the people that I've talked to, they describe what, we know in UFO lore as the Greys. And in your book, you also include some accounts from your volunteers, one in particular, who had encounters with reptilian beings. And I just want to read a short excerpt. He said, quote, "They were reptilian and humanoid, trying to make me understand, not with words, but with gestures. They wanted me to look into their bodies. I saw inside them and understood reproduction, what it's like before birth, the passage into the body. Once I established what they were communicating, they didn't just fade away. They stayed there for quite a while." It's interesting for me to hear so many experiences that sound exactly like alien abductions. And early in your book, in the first few pages, you said, "Those who have undergone alien abductions and their advocates may interpret my suggestion that DMT is intimately involved in these events as a challenge to the, quote, reality of their experiences." What are you telling us here? Does DMT play a role in these cases of abductions that people have reported for, for the last 50 years?
Yeah, the whole thing about alien abduction and contact experience was completely off of my radar before I began my research. And even, while it was taking place, it was only afterwards, when my study was completed and I was starting to look around for other models by which to understand the DMT effect, that I stumbled onto the alien contact experience, the ET experience. So, one of the first interviews that I had with anyone after the DMT book came out was with Whitley Strieber. His first book was called Communion. And, he challenged me and was saying, well, there's stigma with a contact experience. There's implants and there's burns, and also, there's evidence, like there's a spot in the woods which the ground's been compressed or burnt or whatnot. So I began to think about a spectrum of effects of contact, or a spectrum of contact experiences. Like on one end of the spectrum is the purely physical contact experience, where there are implants and burns and cuts and things like that. And on the other end of the spectrum are the purely consciousness to consciousness contact experiences. So I'm more thinking the DMT may possibly explain the consciousness to consciousness type of contact experience. Keep in mind that there aren't any data out there on levels of DMT in non-drug altered states, like contact experiences, near-death states, meditation, anything like that. But still, to the extent that the two states resemble each other, in other words, to the extent that giving DMT replicates certain, features of these non-drug states, then it only makes, sense that there's some underlying common biological, process occurring. So there's a couple of, ways of, looking at that. You could give DMT to people that have been abducted, and you could ask them to compare their experiences. And I don't think that's been, done yet. I would imagine that, it's occurred, people that have, been abducted have smoked DMT, but I haven't heard any reports within, subject comparison, as it were. And, if in the future, we are able to, measure naturally occurring levels of DMT, it would be of interest to compare levels in people either, being abducted or who are, prone to being abducted, to compare their levels with, levels in, normal controls.
As a slight tangent, I also think it would be really interesting to explore studies on identical twins in terms of DMT. That's just a side thought, but I think that would be very cool.
Well, so what would you compare?
Well, just to see if their biological chemical makeup and the similarity of it results in similar or potentially identical experiences, or whether, despite their chemical makeup, they still have completely different trips, I guess.
Well, one interesting aspect, too, is if you speak with identical twins, they often will describe a kind of, telepathy.
Exactly,
which exists between them. So it would be interesting, to determine if a straight identical twin would be able to kind of read the trip that a person is having on DMT.
Yeah.
Or else if they're both, tripping at the same time, if they're, sharing the experience, together.
Within the same plane, yeah.
Dr. Strassman, we're quickly running out of time, but I just want to get to two more questions and a comment. The one question is from the chat room, and it goes kind of with what we were talking about right now. The question is, out of all your studies, has any two people ever had an almost identical trip/experience?
Well, there's a great consistency among trip reports. So, while I don't think anybody has, had like an exact same trip as, somebody else, the general contours are quite, similar. The onset is very rapid. There's a, feeling of your consciousness, separating from your body. You enter into a world of light, which is, full of rapidly moving, morphing, buzzing, shapes. Which, coalesce into more recognizable objects with which one interacts. There, seems to be a, kind of narrow, range or, circumscribed range of effects within this state. Quite consistent. It's quite strange, and it's quite consistently strange. So there, seems to be, something that
is inherent, either in the person or inherent or intrinsic to the external plane of reality that, people tap into with, DMT. It isn't like, sometimes you see your body, changing shape, or, sometimes you start laughing hysterically, or, sometimes you want to jump up and down. It's, a lot more consistent. Like you quickly enter into a, familiar, easily recognizable alternative, world, which is quite, comparable from person to person and within the same person from dose to dose.
The other quick question we have in the chat was, can you overdose on DMT?
Like overdose, like die?
Yeah, I think that would be...
I've never heard of anybody dying on either ayahuasca or on DMT. There is the occasional ayahuasca, death report, but if you look at them carefully, it's usually, some other, substance or, something else, that was mixed with the ayahuasca. There was an ayahuasca, death in Canada a number of years ago, and that ended up, being a, case of, tobacco poisoning. They were swallowing a lot of tobacco juice at the same time they were drinking ayahuasca.
Wow.
And, there was some, kid from Marin County who ended up, dying at a retreat, center in Peru. But, that was, probably, from San Pedro cactus, like mescaline, and, God knows what else. But, DMT, there is that, that case report of that schizophrenic woman whose heart stopped on IV DMT. So if you've got a unstable heart, like if you've got heart disease or you've, had a heart attack, I suppose if you smoke DMT, it could stress your heart to the point of having a heart attack. But that wouldn't be specifically the DMT. That would be your heart disease being stressed. Like exercise might stress your heart, and you would die from a heart attack if you weren't careful. But DMT seems medically relatively non-toxic. But at the same time, I get emails a few times a year from parents or relatives of people that have just smoked too much DMT, and they've developed especially difficult to treat psychosis. They're in jail. They're in the hospital.
Wow.
They've got a bad case of the dwindles. They just have not really pulled themselves out of the DMT wormhole, as it were.
Wow.
So you can have problems with DMT, psychological problems, spiritual problems. One thing which I've encountered surprisingly frequently is young people that have smoked a lot of DMT, and they're convinced that they've got the answer, the answer.
Yeah.
And it isn't especially profound what they've come up with, but if you point that out to them, or you kind of ask them to lighten up, or include other people in their party, or think about it from other people's point of view, they get extremely defensive. Like, you should know better, or I've got the secret to the universe and I just have to tell you. So I think it's those kind of people who continue smoking DMT, and they become quite wrapped up in their own mindset and worldview that start to have some problems when they're challenged by the outside world, and those are the ones who might end up getting psychotic or ending up in jail.
Dr. Strassman, it's a bit kind of my personal thoughts. I just kind of wanted to bounce it off of you before we let you go. But, just kind of talking to people the last few years, it seems that we're living in a time that it kind of echoes the 60s in a strange way, and not in the positive ways. The war in Iraq, it was just as unpopular as Vietnam was in those days. We've seen lately the unfortunate cases of police brutality and racism on literally like a daily basis, which is very similar to the civil rights struggles that was going on in the 60s. And equally, it seems that just as psychedelics were popular during that time, they seem to be making this comeback, if you will. Do you think that our social context has something to do with the interest in DMT and psychedelics and such?
Yeah. It is really striking how similar these last few years have been with respect to the 60s. Yeah, the racism, the interest in psychedelics again, kind of a pacifist mentality. You've heard the expression 3 steps forward, 2 steps back.
and things go in waves. But still, well, I suppose it isn't that they go in waves or even cycles, but they go in a spiral. They go around and around, but they also go directionally forward.
Mm-hmm.
So I would hope that we've learned more, or we've learned something which will make us returning to a similar point of ignorance easier to break through this time, and then we'll forget about it for a while.
Mm-hmm.
The Dark Ages will kind of want to impose their ignorance, but
Mm-hmm.
I think there is an advance in consciousness that's gradually happening. I'm even more interesting, than the recurrence of psychedelic research and racism kinds of questions and pacifism,
Mm-hmm.
is this whole issue of religious fundamentalism, which
Right.
I think is an important one to place into context. I'm not naive enough to believe that drugs are the answer to anything,
Mm-hmm.
especially because psychedelics have been used, for nefarious purposes. The Nazis were into mescaline for their occult studies,
Right.
and, neo-Nazis, like to trip as well. And it will strengthen and, reinforce their, nationalistic,
Mm-hmm.
ethnic, superiority ideas. So there isn't anything, magical about, the drugs themselves, but,
Mhm.
there ought to be, some way, it seems like, to combat religious fundamentalism with the psychedelic state,
Mhm.
if it's channeled in the right way. I think about the psychedelics as tools.
Right.
They can be like a hammer. They can break things, or they can, drive a nail and build things. So I think there ought to be, some attention looked at anyway. I'm not even sure how to articulate the question, but to apply, the beneficial potential of the psychedelic state towards combating, religious fundamentalism.
Wow, that is very true. Dr. Strassman, your website is Rick Strassman, Strassman, Strassman.com. People can go there and order your books. You will sign and inscribe them. And your books are now available not just in physical form, but they can get I believe there's an audiobook, a Kindle version, and all that good stuff, correct?
Right. Yeah. There's a Kindle version for all three. The first one and my newest one, and the co-authored one in the middle. And there's an audiobook, for the first one and the third one.
Very cool. And of course, there's the documentary, if people haven't seen it, DMT, the spirit molecule.
Can I end on one question?
Yep.
I guess it's more of a personal question, but it's related to what you spoke about in chapter 13, I believe, of the spirit molecule. And, one of the questions asked is, what would happen to the study of spirit realms if we could access them reliably using molecules like DMT? So do you personally believe that the world would be a better place if, let's say, we knew how to use DMT and everyone had access to it? Do you think everyone should do it then, and that the world will be a better place, or that it's not something that everyone should tap into?
Well, no. I mean, when people ask me about how to use DMT, should I take it with my antidepressant? I've got cancer. Should I take ayahuasca? I mean, I discourage everybody who emails me from taking drugs. And then when push comes to shove, I say people usually don't take my advice. So that being the case, you should be as well prepared and healthy as you can, and read up on it and study it, and consumer beware. I just don't think everybody should trip. I think if there's three parts to a drug experience, the drug and the set and the setting, the most dispensable of the three is probably drug. I think if you are around good people and you're trying to improve yourself, I think the chances of the world being a better place would probably be, just as great as if it were the case that more people were taking psychedelics. But, that being said, people are still going to take psychedelics in order to improve themselves, improve the world, or to make themselves, weirder, or make the world weirder. I've been around plenty of people who have, taken psychedelics and been just complete jerks. And they, justified by being high. So, they're tools. They can be helpful or they can be destructive.
I think the question about the reality of the spiritual, realms is an interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
There's increasing interest in working on determining the objective nature of the beings.
Yeah.
But I think we have to be super careful about that because, what for? One of the, definitions of the occult is to use spiritual, forces, to use them as opposed to being instructed by them.
Right.
So I think we have to be careful what we're asking for. As crazy or as paranoid as it may sound, what if we do establish a reliable conduit of communication with the beings? Who is in charge here? And, do they want to weaponize us or are we going to try to weaponize them? I think it may open up a real can of worms. So I think any approach to looking at the reality basis of the beings has to be tempered with an ethical and a, religious, sensibility. Foundation, not purely a scientific or commercial or, military one.
Dr. Strassman, thank you so much for being so more than generous with your time. We really appreciate it. Again, we encourage people to check out the website, rickstrassman.com. Check out the books if you haven't. Check out the documentary if you haven't, DMT, The Spirit Molecule. And also check out his other books, DMT and The Soul of Prophecy. And you co-wrote Inner Paths to Outer Space, correct?
Right, yes.
So, Professor Madness wanted me to relay this message. Please give him a personal thank you from me for all he has done to help the research and make it known to everyone and for this awesome interview. And it echoes our sentiment. Dr. Strassman, thank you so much. Hopefully we can have you back on the show in the future because obviously this topic is very layered and you can, go on for hours talking about all these fascinating things. But I want to thank you sincerely for your time, and we hope to have you again in the future.
Thank you so much. And I'd love to end on this quote, one of my favorite quotes, which is, "It's better to ask some of the questions than know all the answers," by James Thurber.
Very nice. Very nice. Thank you so much, Dr.
That's a good quote, yeah. Well, so thanks. Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. I enjoyed talking to both of you, Frank and Genevieve.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strassman. Enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Good night.
Bye.
Wow, that was intense. We literally just went over time. I don't know if people
we didn't take
caught
a break.
that. And we didn't take a break because it was that kind of an interview.
And we kind of started on time. What's happening?
Yeah, Dr. Rick Strassman, it was definitely everything I had hoped in an interview. It was insightful. It was candid. It was honest. And I like that he maintained his neutrality in the topic because it's something that I think gets lost in the zeal of a topic of this nature.
Yeah, no, you couldn't pick holes in his answers and comments and arguments. It was very straight to the point.
Yeah,
no beating around the bush,
Yeah, no, this, again, the type of interview that I go back and listen to again because there's so much in there, to chew on and savor and all that good stuff. So check out the books, like I said, check out the documentary if you haven't. It's a fascinating topic. And honestly, it was a privilege for me to have, Dr. Strassman here tonight and talk about these things. It was really heavy
great.
stuff.
I love biology and psychiatry and anything sciencey. So I was happy to ask some questions there, definitely.
That being said, thank you guys for tuning in tonight. Take care. Be safe. God bless. Don't do anything too crazy. We want to see you back next week. As always, I'm Engineer Frank on Twitter, West of the Rockies on Facebook, Genevieve UA on Twitter.
Yep.
You can catch her every Thursday night right here, same channel, same station, doing her show. No Added Flavors. Yeah. Twitter at No Added Flavors, OURS at the end. Also Facebook, No Added Flavors. So,
so go promote us, go follow us, go share everything.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's what we rely on.
Yeah, support. We're going to go out with a track that, I was going to take a break, but obviously the conversation was just kept moving and, I couldn't put the brakes on that. Nope. So I'm going to play the song that I wanted to play during the break, which is, I think, quite fitting considering the topic. And this one comes by way of Rodriguez, also from our friends at Light in the Attic Records.
Mm-hmm.
And this track, honestly, I love this track. It's called Crucifying Your Mind, and it's genius, if I may say so myself. So enjoy this one. Until next week, guys, take care. We'll see you. Bye-bye.
Au revoir.
West of the Rockies with Frank the Engineer on the Independent FM, Los Angeles.
hangs on a thin thread.
Yeah.
And that is the psyche of man.